With its massive size and sharp horn, a rhinoceros seems like a very intimidating animal. When you see one in a documentary or at a zoo, though, they seem docile. But if it becomes agitated and goes on a rampage, it can cause a lot of damage. I found a video this week of one that was like tossing around a small car like it was a ball or something. Now, I don't know how much it takes to provoke a rhino, but they seem to have thick skin, both literally and maybe figuratively. But the same cannot be said for all of us. We have much thinner skin, literally, but also figuratively. We're easily provoked and offended in personal relationships, but it also happens on a broader level in society. Think about it. Politicians, news media, they exploit those emotional impulses we have with fiery rhetoric and bombastic headlines. We live in a culture of outrage. Now, some of us, we hold our anger in, and we can grow increasingly bitter over time. Others kind of spew their wrath whenever they have the opportunity, whether it's in person or online or whatever. Neither of those responses is helpful. Both of them can be very destructive. And so we need to pray in those hard times, but we seldom do. Now, in Psalms 52 and 53, I think David shows us how to pray when we're offended. And he was not dealing with any minor provocation. The superscript of Psalm 52 says, "To the choir master, a maskil of David, when Doeg, the Edomite, came and told Saul, 'David has come to the house of Ahimelech.'" Now, 12 other psalms, including Psalm 53, as we'll see in a minute, have this title, maskil, which comes from the Hebrew word one of the Hebrew words for wisdom and understanding. And so this song, this prayer, is designed to teach us. And so David uses his experience as an example. And the story is that King Saul had grown jealous of the popularity that young David gained from all of his military victories. And Saul was growing increasingly hostile. After unsuccessfully lashing out at David on several occasions, he sent assassins to his home. But David escaped with the help of his wife, and as he fled, 1 Samuel 21 tells us that he went to Ahimelech, the priest, for help. Now, since David was alone, without his men, Ahimelech suspected that something was wrong. But David claimed that he was meeting up with his men to carry out a mission from the king. And so Ahimelech gave him bread and even the sword that David had taken from Goliath. But this other man, Doeg, witnessed the priest interacting with David. And according to 1 Samuel 21:7, he was the chief of King Saul's herdsmen. And so he later revealed to Saul what had happened. And even though Ahimelech was innocent, Saul commanded that he and all the other priests be executed. Now, the king's guardsmen refused to commit such a heinous act. But Doeg volunteered to do it. He killed 85 priests, along with their wives, children, and livestock. And so Ahimelech's son, Abiathar, was the only one that escaped. He found David, and he told him what had happened. And so 1 Samuel 22:22 tells us, "And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house.'" See, David had a heavy heart, and he confessed his sense of guilt and personal responsibility over what happened. But as he looked to God in prayer, as we have recorded here in Psalm 52, he gave voice to his anger, his frustration over what had happened. Now, Many commentators think that the individual that we'll see described here in Psalm 52 was Doeg. But as we work our way through the psalm, I think we'll see several indications that David was probably referring to King Saul. Now, Psalm 53 doesn't mention a particular event in its superscript, but it stands in this series of psalms that relate to David's time fleeing from King Saul. And so it simply says this. It says, "To the choir master, according to Mahalath, a maskil of David." Now, in other Hebrew contexts, that word, Mahalath, refers to sickness or disease. Perhaps it captured the way David was feeling when he wrote. Now, we'll see in a moment that Psalm 53 begins by mentioning the fool. The fool has said in his heart that there is no God. In Hebrew, the word for fool is Nabal. And so some tie this psalm, Psalm 53, to David's encounter with a man named Nabal that's recorded in 1 Samuel 25. In the psalm, it's interesting, it's almost identical to Psalm 14. But we'll see that this version expresses frustration over the evil of the world as it opposes the people of Israel. And so I think David may have been thinking of Doeg when he wrote this, because Doeg was from the land of Edom. He was a descendant of Esau rather than Jacob. Jacob's also known as Israel, right? And so I think we should consider these two psalms together. Now, another reason for seeing a connection between these psalms is that they follow the same flow of thought. In fact, we'll read through them side by side to see how David responds to his feelings of personal offense with three thoughts. In both Psalms, he thinks of first God's offense, secondly, God's judgment, and third, God's love. And I'm convinced that we need to think the same way. Rather than seething or venting when we're offended, we must learn to pray as David did. So the first thought is of God's offense. Ancient legends tell of ships being swallowed by massive whirlpools. Now, tides may have been different in centuries past, but we have no record of anything on that scale in modern history. The strongest whirlpool is the Saltstraumen maelstrom in Norway, which has been known to form these vortices that are as much as 33 feet wide and 16 feet deep. And so ships certainly avoid those strong currents, but none of them have ever been swallowed up by them. Those legendary whirlpools, though, I think they provide us a good picture of the turbulent emotions that happen when we experience being offended. You know how it is. It feels like you're spinning around. You lose all sense of perspective. You can't see straight. Our focus is sucked inward as our selfish thoughts churn faster and faster. And if we don't escape, we'll end up wrecking our relationships and even our health. And so we need to turn outward. Rather than thinking about our offended feelings, we need to consider God's perspective of our situation. David began both of these psalms with the thought of God's offense. In Psalm 52, verse 1, he says, "Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day." And so steadfast love is what prompted God to enter into a covenant relationship with Israel. The idea is he delights to bless his people, and he gives them his commands as part of that, to guide them. But this mighty man doesn't care about that. So who was that man? Well, since Doeg was an Edomite, he wasn't part of God's covenant people. He really wasn't a recipient of God's steadfast love, but King Saul was. And so Saul should have been humble, grateful, obedient, but he was offending God by ignoring his commands. In verses 2 and 3, as we continue in Psalm 52, David considered how this man's words revealed his heart. First, he says, your tongue plots destruction like a sharp razor, you worker of deceit. And then you love evil more than good and lying more than speaking what is right. And then the Psalms have this little word, Selah. So Doeg, he didn't just speak of destruction, he carried it out. Saul was the one who gave the order, though. And so even though Saul had no literal blood on his hands, his heart was given over to evil and to lies. And that word, Selah, prompts us to stop, pause, think about this. Even when we do the right things externally, even when we're separated from the actions of evil, God is always concerned about the heart. And so David finished his thought here in verse 4 by saying, you love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. So I think he's talking about how Saul turned against the Lord from the core of his being. So how then do we think about the wicked deeds done by someone like Doeg, who was not part of God's covenant people? I mean, in a sense, his actions shouldn't surprise us. And David touches on this as he begins Psalm 53. In verse 1 there, he says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, doing abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. So when people reject the existence of God, moral standards become completely arbitrary. There's no foundation for them. And so God sees them as corrupt fools who do abominable deeds without any trace of goodness. Now, of course, as we look at it in the world, most people do not descend to the level of Doeg's evil action, but David remembered that God is concerned about the heart. Again, it's the same kind of focus. And so in verse 2, and then in 3, he says, God looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. And then he says, they have all fallen away. Together they've become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. So even when unbelieving people hold to some kind of moral standard, they're not really seeking the will of God. I mean, from God's perspective, their motives are still corrupt. Right? They're not doing good in the truest sense. Now, of course, Paul, you may remember, quotes these words that are here and also in Psalm 14 to show that all people need to be saved. So after thinking of the world as a whole, David seems to direct his thoughts back to Doeg in verse 4 of Psalm 53. He says, have those who work evil no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon God. So, as Saul's chief herdsman, Doeg was probably at the tabernacle that day just to deliver some sheep for sacrifices. That would be my guess. And so he had the opportunity to learn about the God of Israel. I mean, as some other foreigners had done. We've talked previously about Rahab and Ruth. But Doeg was just doing a job. He wasn't there to worship or to learn. And so I think he offended the Lord by ignoring that gracious opportunity. But then think of it this way. David put the priests at risk for a few loaves of bread. But Doeg, as David talks about here, slaughtered them as carelessly as David ate those loaves. So as he prayed, David realized that his personal anger over what Saul and Doeg had done could not compare with how deeply they offended God. And see, we need to come to the same realization. When we're offended, we need to look away from our swirling emotions, and we need to prayerfully consider God's perspective the way that David does here. We need to lay the whole situation out before him. Now, of course, we're not informing him of anything. God already knows. But he allows us to pray so that we find our sense of stability in him. The second thought is of God's judgment. You can't tell how strong a tree is at a glance. I mean, it may seem massive and flourishing, while its roots are beginning to rot, or maybe they aren't even grow very deep at all. But when a powerful storm comes along, that tree is put to the test. And if it's not strongly anchored, it will come crashing down. And I think the same could be said about people. I mean, many prosper at the expense of others. Right? They use and abuse people without any hesitation. They may have a significant degree of worldly power, but they lack spiritual roots. And so when someone like that offends you, you can find comfort in knowing that sooner or later the mighty storm of God's judgment will strike them and that they will come crashing down. Now, David turns to this thought next in both Psalms. In Psalm 52, verse 5, he says, "But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from your tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living." And there's that word again, Selah. Think about it. See, one weakness, I'll admit, of reading this as a reference to King Saul is that David always maintained this high level of respect for Saul as God's anointed king. And so you might say, well, he would never say that about Saul. When Saul died in battle at the hand of the Philistines, 2 Samuel 1 tells us that David mourned. But that doesn't mean that David wouldn't acknowledge that Saul would face consequences for his evil deeds. Actually, I think understanding God's judgment may have enabled David to continue to respect Saul in his position despite his vicious hostility. Because over in Romans, in the New Testament, chapter 12, verse 19, Paul said, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." So long before Paul wrote those words, David was living them out. Right? Even though he had several opportunities, he refused to strike Saul. He continued to respect him. He trusted God to handle the situation in his way and his time. And I think that's what he's talking about here in Psalm 52:5. Now, that creates an emotional tension, and I think that's what David turns to next in verses 6 and 7. It's as if he's looking into the future, and he says, "The righteous, when this time of judgment happens, the righteous shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him, saying, 'See the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and sought refuge in his own destruction.'" Now, I doubt that Doeg had an abundance of riches as Saul's chief herdsman, but we know that Saul, as a king, did to some degree. And he's the one who had given up trusting in the Lord. And so God's judgment against such people is a frightening thing. It should never be taken lightly. But the laughter that David talks about here expresses this sense of relief in knowing that people who seem so untouchable now will one day be snatched up, torn down, uprooted when the storm hits. Now, David has similar thoughts about God's judgment over in Psalm 53, verse 5. But he compressed them into just 3 packed lines. Here's what he said: "There they are, in great terror, where there is no terror. For God scatters the bones of him who encamps against you. You put them to shame, for God has rejected them." So in other words, when God's judgment comes, people like Doeg, who have never feared God, will be overcome with fear, even terror at God's judgment. I mean, in that culture, people would show respect for a person's remains by gathering their bones together with in a family tomb. In fact, David expressed appreciation for the brave men of a town called Jabesh Gilead, who went and stole Saul's body back from the Philistines in order to give him a respectful burial. Now, we don't know what actually happened to Doeg after this event, but David said that the unbelievers that in view here, in this broad way that he's talking here in the psalm, wouldn't be afforded that kind of dignity. Right? Their bones would be scattered. They would be put to shame because God had rejected them. The New Testament gives us further clarity about God's judgment. Many Old Testament passages on the subject could be interpreted in a temporal sense, meaning that someone would simply die or be defeated in battle. But when you look to the end of the Bible, to Revelation chapter 20, it reveals that people will be resurrected to stand before God's judgment. And those whose names are written in the book of life will enter into a new heaven and a new earth. They'll be saved through the death and resurrection of Jesus. But everyone else, those who haven't believed, who haven't trusted, they'll be judged according to their deeds and sentenced to eternal punishment in the lake of fire. So when you're offended, don't lash out, don't retaliate, entrust the situation to the Lord. Leave it to Him. Trust that He will bring ultimate justice for every evil word or action that you've experienced. That leads us to one more thought. And the third one is the thought of God's love. Now, to us, olive trees may seem scraggly or insignificant, but they were considered extremely valuable in the ancient world. I mean, they produced olives for food, of course, but they also yielded, of course, the oil that people would use back then for baking and cooking, even like we do now. And that oil was also burned in lamps to provide a light. It was their light source. It was their main source of energy. On top of that, olive trees are evergreens. And they can live on average, people say, up to 500 years. Some are older, much older. And so think about it. In contrast to the mighty man who would be uprooted, torn down, shattered, David thought of God's love and His connection to it. And he saw himself as this olive tree. Right? In Psalm 52, verses 8 and 9, he says, "But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the steadfast love of God forever and ever." And then he says, "I will thank you forever because you have done it. I will wait for your name, for it is good in the presence of the godly." In verse 1, remember we saw the steadfast love of God was what made the mighty man's evil so offensive. But as David thought of God's love, he speaks of it here as the thing that gives him life and vitality. So he envisions himself as being planted near the house of God. Now that's an interesting phrase because that would typically be used of the temple, but the temple wasn't built until after David died. So some people conclude that this psalm was written later. It wasn't written by David, but someone else. Now, if it was David, he could have been referring to the tabernacle, even though it was a tent rather than a permanent dwelling. But I also think, as I look at some of David's psalms, that it's possible that he understood that the earthly temple and tabernacle pointed to a heavenly reality of the throne room of God in heaven. And so whatever house he meant, his main point was that he found strength in the presence of God to overcome this offensive situation. So think about it. He was fleeing for his life, but he believed that God would still be faithful to him. Even as he's running away, he's committing himself to being eternally thankful for all that God's done. Rather than trying to take charge and handle the situation in his own power, he pledged to wait, right, along with other godly believers, to wait for God to act. Now, someone might accuse him of being passive. I mean, he was a powerful military leader by that point. He could have overthrown Saul's reign, but he wouldn't do it. When he was offended, he chose to respond in faith. So David thought of God's love in very personal terms there in Psalm 52. In Psalm 53, he thinks of the broader implications of God's love for the people of Israel. And he prays this: "Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion, when God restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad." Now, Zion is first mentioned in 2 Samuel 5 as a stronghold on one of the hills in Jerusalem. Of course, it became David's capital city. And so he's asking, I think what he's praying here is that God would bring salvation to the people of Israel through his family line. Later, the New Testament revealed how this salvation has and will come about. Because we know that Jesus was a descendant of David, born roughly 1,000 years after David's time. And that Jesus lived a perfectly righteous life and died a sacrificial death to satisfy the wrath of God for sin. He rose from the dead, he ascended into heaven, and one day he will return to reign over the entire earth from Zion and Jerusalem. He'll bring true blessing and prosperity to Israel, but also to the entire earth. And so when we suffer terrible offenses, we should pray for his return, because that's God's ultimate solution. So do you believe in the steadfast love of God? Are you willing to pray and trust and wait? I mean, even when we're surrounded by great evil, we can thrive. We can be like that green olive tree by faith in the steadfast love of God. So when you're offended, I'm challenging you to pray. Think of God's offense over the matter, because it's much deeper than yours. Think of God's judgment. Trust him to bring ultimate justice over the situation. And think of God's love. And draw the strength that you need from that, from the hope of salvation. So if you're not familiar with this story from David's life, I'd encourage you to read it for yourself. You'll find it in 1 Samuel 19 all the way through chapter 22. And if you don't have a relationship with God, I would encourage you to seek him today. Learn about him from the Bible. Begin to trust his plan for life, his guidance, his wisdom. Believe that he is a God who saves, who rescues us from our sins. He alone can pull us out of that swirling vortex of our anger so that we can find true peace. If you're a believer, how are you handling those offensive situations in your life? Are you too easily provoked? As we grow in our faith, we should develop thicker skin. Are you still caught spinning in some long past situation? If so, I encourage you to entrust it to the Lord. Perhaps you've tried, but anger just keeps welling up in you. I have situations like that too. And what I've found is that we just need to keep praying. Every time it comes to mind, you have to hand it over to him again. Or maybe you're on the other side of this equation. Have you offended someone with your words or your actions? I mean, realize that those horizontal conflicts with people affect your vertical relationship with God. Seek reconciliation in both directions. Humbly confess your sin to God and to the person you've offended. Go back to Psalm 51. That's what we talked about last time as we looked at the Psalms. So may God fill us with his peace.